All right. Yeah, I think we're more or less complete. Let's see if there's more people joining on the way. Okay, so yeah, thank you guys for joining. Yeah, thanks for joining the analyst call. We essentially did a few times internally, and now it's a public session essentially. So it's open for everybody, and we're going to invite people essentially for these calls. And the goal is again to talk about some new features, some upcoming features, what's going on with Flow.BI essentially. It's the basic idea. All right, so yeah, safe harbor statement, especially the features that we discuss here that are upcoming. Well, we're working on those, so we are not, we can't guarantee that every feature we talk here, every upcoming feature will make it into a tool. But again, we discuss both. We discuss new features which are in the tool already, and we're discussing upcoming features, but no guarantee. So I want to discuss essentially what happened in the last 3 months. By the way, we have a Q&A afterwards, so if you want to discuss or ask some questions, you're open, right? So you're free to ask questions essentially. So I want to talk about some model improvements, web front end, back end, the roadmap, and some. I skipped the business topics here, but yeah, that's the idea. So for those of you who don't know Flow.BI yet, Flow is essentially a Gen AI to define the raw data vault and only the raw data vault, right? So, but with that said, having said that, with all the hubs defined, including the business keys, so Flow.BI selects essentially the best business key for your data to integrate it across multiple data sources. With the links, with the satellites, including security, privacy, and rate of change splits, and including special entity types like FAT satellites, non-historized links, reference data, reference hubs and satellites, and so on. It's fully data-driven, so which means that it needs data. So Flow.BI really looks at your data and your metadata, but the metadata is optional, to derive a raw data vault for your data essentially, and that integrates across all your data sources that you attach. So we're not building a data vault for just one data source. We're building a data vault model for all your data that you attached from all the data sources essentially that you attach to Flow.BI, an integrated enterprise data warehouse solution. And we only generate a logical model, so we only decide on the hubs and satellites that you need for capturing all the data. And then we hand over this metadata of our logical model over to one of the established players. At the moment, we support Data Vault Builder and Data Vault for DBT by Scalefree. And then there's more tools to come. So we are short to make some announcements. Can't make them today, but there's some additional integrations in the works essentially that's coming up. So quite a few actually. And then so these tools then will generate essentially as usual the physical code, the create table statements and insert statements, and we provide the metadata for both. So we provide the metadata for the structure of your model and for the movement of the data from the source into your raw data vault essentially. All right, having said that, for everybody who's new, on the model side, we did some small changes. There's some bug fixes in there, some inconsistencies we fixed essentially, but it's nothing big essentially. There are some changes coming regarding the model. So, but yeah, it's 1 second, there's people coming here. Where's the list? There you go. So there will be some changes coming on the model side, but again, not super big ones because the model more or less is done. I don't want to say that we don't change it anymore, but I'm focusing on other stuff at the moment. So we did something, but only minor stuff. Same for the web front end. The biggest change is an update of the reporting engine. Some of you know we use an external reporting engine for building our metadata-based reports essentially, lineage reports and so on that we can build. And we update the reporting engine to the latest one because of some bugs inside the system. The maps no work, which we don't need, okay. But then also some smaller bugs here and there we had essentially in the engine. Those are fixed. And then again, some bug fixes in the web front end. The biggest, I mean, there was a time initially when I was when I wasn't where it didn't feel good to open up Flow.BI to the public because we had so many bugs in the web front end. Most of those bugs are gone. So the usability of the web front is much better these days. We can really work with the application now, which is nice. There are some additional features which we discussed in the last call. Essentially, an estimate button and a test button in the data source, for example. So you can test your data source connection. Is it correct? Or what's the error message? Is the hostname correct? And so on. and then estimate price button is there. So you get a essentially not a quote, but a feedback on how expensive it would be to attach this data source essentially to the model. And then there are some new features coming up, but I'll talk about that. So there's some bigger changes in the works at the moment on the user interface, or bigger additions, not a change. So they're quite busy at the moment. The biggest change I want to discuss today is really on the backend side, because we have two new features, and we discussed them also in some webinars already. Let's bring your own bucket and local data processing. Those features we introduced because of customer feedback we talked to. So they had some concerns, let's say, because the initial design was that Flow.BI would connect directly to your data source. So your data source must be in the cloud, or at least accessible from the cloud, open port in your firewall, that kind of stuff. And then we would pull all the data from your data sources and the metadata all into our own data lake. So we can then run our data profiling queries, for example, against your data and start doing the profiling jobs to derive the raw data model essentially. And that's an issue because we have all the data from the customer. I mean, the data, right? Not just the metadata. And that was the first concern. Well, the biggest concern essentially. And we address this with two new features. The first feature is the bring your own bucket feature. That's essentially, so this is the current, no, so this, so this is the new situation. Sorry, that's the new feature here. So initially the data lake and the analytical service was on our premise, in our cloud environment, the yellow box here, and we moved it out. So bring your own bucket means that you can bring your own data bucket, let's say an S3 bucket or a Azure bucket, and it's inside your scope, it's inside your environment, just like the database automation tools. It's inside your environment essentially, and the querying tool as well, like Athena, for example, we use, or the SQL Server pool on the Azure side. Those will be on your side essentially, and then we don't store your data anymore. However, we process it still in this feature. So still the data comes from the data source, runs through our system here, our agent here, and then pushes it into your data lake for processing downstream and so on. So we have to address that one in the next feature essentially. But again, two features. So that's the first one. Architecture-wise, the idea is that when you bring your own bucket, on AWS, for example, you would essentially define your own S3 data lake that we would essentially use from our backend side, load the data from the source systems into your bucket, and then also use an Athena cluster, either our own one, because we also maintain a Athena workspace, or you could also define your Athena cluster. So we need your credentials, or we need to get credentials from your side, and then our system can connect to your Athena cluster, run the queries against your S3 bucket, and then consume essentially the results. And the results are still data, right? So Athena will deliver data downstream to our system. So we're still processing your data in this scenario. So wait for it, essentially, for the next feature. All right. And then everything is as usual. So we have the metadata in the repository. We provide it via SQL API, via REST API to the web front ends, to the database automation tools, and so on. Here's the same architecture on Azure, where we use storage accounts to store your data, and then an elastic SQL pool to query your data. And that it's not optional. You have to provide this, so we can access this one to run our queries essentially. So that's the first feature. And then the second feature to complete the scenario here, because in the best case, we don't see your data anymore, right? We don't store it, we don't process it. That's where local data processing comes into play. That's the second part of the story. Local data processing essentially means that we provide you with a Docker image, a Docker container, where we move those agents, those components essentially, that look at your data, we essentially move out of our space, into your environment. So the data loader, the meta loader, and the data profiler, those three elements interact directly with your data sources. And they will essentially load data. For example, the data loader, well, it starts with the meta loader. The meta loader loads your, apparently by the name, gets your metadata from the sources and loads the metadata into a metadata lake and into the repository. That's still happening. So we only make sure no data is stored anymore, but we don't, but we still keep your metadata essentially, like the column names, the entity names, the names about the, one second, there's people joining, the names about the, like comments, for example, on the fields and so on. That's what we still capture. But the data is not being processed, it's not loaded anymore into this environment here anymore. Oh, sorry. It's essentially loaded from the data loader, from your data source into your own bucket. And then like this one here, the arrow goes from here to here. And then from the data lake using the analytical services, the data profiler will then consume the data, but the data provider will not load any data to the environment here, to our environment. It will only upload metadata. So the meta loader will essentially capture the metadata from the source systems, and the data profiler will then send essentially lots of float values essentially to our repository only. So, but we don't see your data anymore. There's nothing, no data to transfer anymore. It's all run on your environment. You have the bucket, and you run this container here. Be aware that's not just one container. You have to scale it up, right? So there will be plenty of nodes running for a while. But that's the basic idea. So all the data goes around our environment, and we only receive metadata from your system essentially. And then the processing is done as usual. So we do the data mining, the model generation, the expert system. We also have the UI on top on the of the repository. So you still have your results in our typical user environment in the cloud and so on. That's the current state essentially. And the tools can just integrate as usual. Can integrate via the SQL API or REST API with our services. There's no difference for the tools. They might run in their own cloud, or they might run in your cloud. That's all up to you and the vendor you selected essentially. So we're out of that. But they still interact with our cloud-based environment essentially. So that makes it much easier for us to deal with the rest essentially. That's the idea. Yeah, as I said, it's not just one container. So what we do is internally we use an ECS cluster to run to scale up the instances essentially on the data loader, meta loader, and the data profiling. And that's what you want to do as well, because if you have only one cluster or one node running, it will take a while to process your data sources. Because again, we're looking at your data essentially, or at least Docker image looks at your data. So you have to run this container here essentially using some ECS cluster most probably, or something similar, Kubernetes or something to run these nodes essentially. And then this local Docker container is not one, it's a number of containers, gets the data from your sources, loads the data into your own data lake, uses your own Athena installation, so it's not optional anymore. You must provide this to run the profiling queries, for example, and by data profiler. And then all these components that we saw, especially the meta loader and the data profiler, they will send some metadata to the repository. The only thing that the data loader loads to the repository is the number of records, for example, to get an understanding of how many rows are we looking at, for example. That's all we see essentially. And that's also sent by the data loader into the repository, into the backend, and that's it. So that's the environment on AWS, and similarly on Azure, we have a similar environment now. We still use the storage account and the SQL Elastic pools. That's the bring your own bucket feature essentially. And then we have the local Flow.BI container running on container instances, for example, where you essentially scale them up and then run load the metadata only into the Flow.BI backend. And again, everything else is the same. You could use the local data processing without the bring your own bucket feature. I don't believe it makes much sense. I don't believe that anybody wants to do that, but you could actually do that. We could also store your data if you don't provide the bring your own bucket container. If you don't, storage account or something. If you don't provide a bucket, we would store your data and you would only process it, but it makes no sense. I don't believe that anybody's going for that. Well, the disadvantages, you have to pay for the compute, it's one thing. And then the other thing is you have to set it up, right? So the most convenient solution is if we manage everything for you, you just attach your data sources and we do the storage and the processing. But this gives you the option of changing that. So if you don't want to go that way, we're good with that. So that approach works for us as well. But you have to set it up. Well, our partners can help you set this up, but it's a bit more effort essentially to get up and running essentially. But that's the only drawback essentially. Other than that, it's the same. You get essentially the same container that we run internally. We did some additional security on it, but other than that, it's more or less the same container essentially. All right. So let's discuss some new upcoming features. So those features are the main features essentially for Q1. That's what we built. Again, we're building on some new features which are coming up. So let me just look at the roadmap. And some of you know this roadmap again. We discussed over the last couple of analyst calls in the past. We improved the user journey. It was a number one ticket for me essentially. We have descriptive error message these days, so it's much better from error message perspective. There's test button for data source connections, which was a bummer. Essentially, when you set up a new data source, you never knew if what's going on. We have to look at the log files all the time, what's going on with your data source connection. There's a forecast button or estimate button for the cost per data source. Again, it's just an estimate, right? So it's not no 100% guarantee. And then the new features coming up is essentially that we work on a feature where you can influence the business key identification. Most people, well, there's two reasons for this feature. One reason is that most people want to have some say in the business keys. And what we allow now is, or in the upcoming feature, we allow that you essentially provide or set up a preference for certain columns to be used as business keys or not used. So you can also have a negative value on this. So you can essentially prioritize or deprioritize certain input columns to be used for the business key, essentially. And then if it works out, if the AI identifies, well, yeah, that works for me, then it would go for it, but there's no guarantee. So the AI will have the last say. That's what it is, because we try to find a overall solution. And if the business key or the columns that you provide or define, prioritize for the business key doesn't meet the requirements or doesn't work out, then so be it. Flow.BI might or might not skip it, right? So might ignore your decision essentially. So that's number one. So people want to have some say about the business keys. And then the other thing is, some people have concerns that when we do a run of your source data, come up with a model, and then you run you hit the red button again and regenerate the model, that Flow.BI generates a new model completely independent from the previous version. So it might lead to changes in the model, different business keys selected, and maybe different decisions on the modeling essentially. And yes, there is some true story behind that, because in some cases, when Flow.BI has to make a decision and it has multiple options and every option is equally the same, it might do a random option by just going for one or the other option essentially. So there's some randomness inside the model generation in some cases. If you don't have, or if you have an equal amount of information or different options essentially, let's say that. So there might be some changes in the model, even though nothing changed in the source and so on. There might be changes because your data sources change, or you added more data sources, and that lead to a different business key selection or something, right? Because the more data Flow.BI knows, the more it can figure out what's going on, how to integrate your data sources. It gets better understanding of your data sets essentially, and then might make a different decision on the business key selection. So there might be some drivers for a different decision essentially, either random or better data, more data, changing data, and so on. And people have concerns that this would change the model completely, and the model is not stable essentially. Now, what we're going to do is those business keys we selected, because the business key here in any data vault design, not just by Flow.BI, but in any data vault design, the business key selection has essentially a drastic impact on a lot of other topics, the hub itself, but also the links referring to the hub, the satellites describing the hub, and so on. So if the business key changes, I see that there's a good amount of changes moving through your data model essentially. And what we're doing is we're adding essentially all the business keys we selected in the first run or in the next runs. All those business key columns that we selected for the business key, we're adding to this list of the keys that you can influence, which means that the first run influences the next run. Or in other terms, we give preference in the second run to those business key columns, or to those columns that we selected the last time. So in that preference will stabilize the solution, even though that the model that we generated the second time isn't that much different, because typically we have enough information to make a good decision or a clear decision on what we want to do. So it's not that the model changes drastically essentially, especially if you provide more data sets. The more data you provide, the more information we have to make a decision. And so it's not that changing that much essentially, but that will stabilize it even further essentially. So in that sense, we're going to use this feature, and which means that we're loading the business keys that we selected into this table for you. And again, you can influence this. You can drop them. You can change. I'm not sure if there's no priority feature, but you can drop them essentially from the table, or put them on a negative list or something. So you can modify this list. But then again, you influence the model run, and you will get a new model essentially, right? That's what it is. All right. The integration of email documentation is also a feature. It's not prioritized at the moment because at the moment the front-end developers, they're working on these two bold features here, on the business key identification and the next one here. Set of initial reports is also on stalled a bit. We started with this, but it's currently in wait. We're coming back on that. So the idea is to build or to set up some initial reports essentially for users on the data sources, on the results, on billing, compliance, and so on. So that's coming up essentially. And then another big feature we're working on is translation of metadata. So what we see is essentially, in some cases, you're dealing with data sources where you're dealing with a well, let's rephrase this. By default, in Flow.BI, everything's in English. So we generate a model in a target model in English, for example, hub, customer kind of stuff, everything's in English. Which means that if you, let's say you want to build an English data warehouse and your data sources are mostly in English, okay, fine. But what about the one data source in German, for example? Like, for example, Star Money, for example. Star Money will give you German metadata for the column names. So that leads, if you don't do anything, it leads to satellites, for example, with German attribute names. And then you attach a Greek data source or a Polish data source or what else, and then you have all this mix of languages inside your raw data vault satellite. So the idea is that we provide you a screen in the influence section, just like the new feature here for the business keys. Those are two new tabs in the influence screen, essentially, where you can translate the metadata coming from the source. And that leads to a full English raw data vault. So you can translate the metadata coming from the source, the entity names, the column names, the comments, for example, all that's being fed in essentially through the translation engine. And you can either do this manually, or you can use a machine translation service where we essentially run your input data through the machine translation service and then put this into your model essentially. And then you can again adjust everything coming from the translation service. So that's one feature for the sources, but then for the target as well. What if you don't want to produce a non-English data vault? Let's say everything must be in German or something, which we see sometimes with some bigger corporations where everything must be in a certain language, or with government, for example, where everything must be in the language of the country, essentially. And in this case, you can use the same feature. So the same screen will give you also the targets, and you can essentially run machine translation or manual translation on the target model and translate everything from English, which we use in our rule engine, in the expert system, over to your target language. Yeah, so, and this feature essentially came in or has some priority because of these typical German data sources with abbreviations like SAP, where you get MNDT, and every English-speaking data consultant here knows that MNDT is the mandant in German, and that's a tenant, right? So you know that, and KDNR is the customer number, and so on, right? I'm surprised that people know this actually, non-German people know this, and but it's not very usable. Let's say that. So so you can translate those abbreviations as well into meaningful, longer English terms. Essentially, that's where the prioritization comes from. Okay. Translate these German abbreviated source systems into something readable in English in the raw data vault, and then translate everything into your final language of the data platform, essentially. So that's it. Those two bold items here are priority items at the moment. That's my hope is that by next for the next analyst call, we can discuss this and just mute somebody here. And the yeah, so we can essentially present a feature with screenshots, or at least, or maybe live and so on. All right. Any questions from your side? Because that's from my side. Focus was on two larger tickets essentially. And yeah, the next tickets will be also larger essentially. So I don't expect there will be one change in the model, a bigger change, and then but not such a big change. And those two features here hopefully inside the user interface. They're in the backend already actually. So the backend already provides both the translation service and the business key identification influence option essentially. It's already in the backend. Any questions from your side? All right. So I don't see anything popping up here. Just double check if you missed something on the chat now. Okay, so yeah, and thanks for joining. I believe I'm done. Yeah, so if you're interested in Flow.BI, get in touch with us. We will share the recording with you on the media area of Flow.BI on our website. And then, yeah, hope to see you in one of the projects, upcoming projects. Thank you guys.